December 2024. We welcome as a guest member for this inquiry Bob Blackman, CBE, Chairman of the Backbench Business Committee, who introduced the landmark Homeless Reduction Act 2017 as a private member's bill. Welcome, Bob. Welcome to all our witnesses. Homelessness has reached the highest level since records began. A shortage of social housing and affordable private rented accommodation, along with welfare reforms and increased pressure on local housing, has all contributed to this increase in homelessness. Today, we will examine the government's understanding of the extent, causes and costs of homelessness, and to establish if enough support has been provided to local authorities who are the front line in tackling this crisis amongst some very vulnerable members of our constituencies. So today we have as witnesses, and we are delighted to welcome you, Sarah Healey, CBE, CVO, the Permanent Secretary of MHCLG. Welcome. We have Catherine Francis to her left, who is the Director General for Local Government and Resilience and Communities. Welcome, Catherine. We have on Sarah's right Penny Hobman, the Director for Homeless and Rough Sleeping. Welcome, Penny. And from the Department of Work and Pensions, James Wolfe, who we've seen before, who is the Director for Poverty, Families and Disadvantage. But Jenan Hasan, who is the Director of Housing and Universal Credit. It is his first time, so a special warm welcome to you, Jenan. Thank you for coming. So without any further ado, I think we're going to move on and ask Sarah Healey, if I may, you the first question. And if you could give us an update on homelessness numbers, please. What are the latest numbers, please?
Oh, gosh, I might have to...
Oh, I thought I was bailing you a soft.
Well, that was a fairly sort of open public bit of information. So, June 2024 latest total households in temporary accommodation 123,000, families 78,000, and children in temporary accommodation 159,000. Families in bed and breakfast almost 6,000. Those in bed and breakfast over 6 weeks, almost 4,000, and out-of-area placements are 39,000. I mean, I think it's sort of worth saying that the sort of striking thing about these numbers is the extent to which they've gone up consistently over time. In particular, even since the last quarter, we're talking about around 5% rises across most of those numbers, and most strikingly outlier to that is families in B&B over 6 weeks, where it's an over 16% increase from the previous quarter. So, I mean, as you say, record levels and rising, and has been for some time.
Thank you for that. That's a helpful opening. I'm now going to turn to my colleague Bob Blackman to ask about the Homeless Reduction Act. Bob.
Thank you, Sir Geoffrey. Obviously, thank you for the figures that you've just provided us with. Obviously, the aim of the Homelessness Reduction Act 2017 is to reduce the number of people ending up homeless at all. Now, the stats from the department show that roughly between 200 and 324,000 people, households a year, are owed a relief or prevention duty. Now, cumulatively, that figure comes to just over 1.7 million households over the period of time the Act has been in operation. But only 776,990 households have actually got permanent accommodation. So the first thing is, what's gone wrong?
Well, I mean, I suppose the best way to follow on with that is a reflection on how we've ended up in the position of having homelessness at record levels. I mean, it's obviously a sort of deeply troubling and, upsetting set of kind of circumstances because of the impact and cost of that homelessness causes, the way it affects other outcomes, the particular impact that it has on children's outcomes, educational outcomes, and other health outcomes. And I suppose one of the most kind of shocking things in the NAO report is the mention of the 55 children whose deaths can be associated with the quality of housing that they had in temporary accommodation. So it's obviously a very, very difficult, very bad situation.
That covers, if I may, that obviously covers the condition in which of housing that people are put in, but it doesn't actually deal with the overall numbers, the huge numbers of people
indeed.
that are presumably there are an awful lot of people that have slipped through the net here that haven't even been provided with temporary accommodation.
Perfectly possible, actually, and of course the hidden homeless is a major sort of issue that we're very much aware of, where they don't come to light. I suppose the first thing I'd say is that, kind of as the architect of the Homelessness Reduction Act, actually for a period of time, numbers in temporary accommodation did stabilise post the introduction of the Act. So there was a period of time when clearly what the Act was aiming to do, which was to try and identify people at an earlier stage and intervene in order to ensure that they were not homeless, and therefore the preventative action could be taken before you got to the point of giving relief into temporary accommodation, was working. And when we saw rises, we were seeing rises in the number of single people who were in temporary accommodation who previously would not have been picked up by the system, and that in fact all that showed was that there had been unmet need for vulnerable people in the system beforehand that had not been identified and was now being identified, and so the rise in numbers came there.
The estimate we had originally was 300,000 people sofa surfing every single day, irrespective of those that were actually homeless.
Yeah.
Can I also follow that up with the issue of then, we've got the numbers, we know the numbers. During COVID, we actually got everyone in. Under the Everyone In programme. So what changed from everyone in to now seeing these huge numbers of people that are homeless?
Yeah, so obviously Everyone In particularly focused on rough sleepers being sort of brought into accommodation
to
during
make sure that there were no people
COVID period. Plus there was obviously a whole set of interventions in order to prevent homelessness, particularly the sort of ban on evictions under Section 21. The significant, and Penny worked on Everyone In, so she might want to sort of reflect a little bit more about what worked about that particular programme and what's changed subsequently. But I think it's worth saying that series of things that happened subsequent to the pandemic that have caused this massive increase. I mean, there's an underlying scarcity of supply problem, and I think it's just sort of, that is just an accepted fact that there is a major issue with the supply of housing. There is a major issue with the supply of housing that is social and affordable in nature, and therefore is housing that is available to those who would be looking at the sort of bottom end of the market, or kind of find sort of a lot of private rented sector properties unaffordable. And then we've had, combined with that, a cost of living pressures that have come from inflationary pressures and significant increases in rents in the private rented sector. And all of that, I think, has kind of come together to lead to a very, very significant rise in homelessness that is not what happened in the early years of the Homelessness Reduction Act. And those are a series of... We know that homelessness is a complex problem caused by an overlapping set of causes. In this instance, you've got some social causes combined with some economic circumstances that has just made the problem very, very, very difficult and challenging.
You also mentioned the 55 children, very sadly, who've lost their lives because of the accommodation that they're in. There was a requirement in the Act, and there still is, still law, for local authorities to inspect homes, that particularly where vulnerable families were being placed, particularly those fleeing domestic violence and other such areas. Is it that local authorities are not carrying out their duties, or is there another problem that we need to solve?
I mean, I think it's very hard to sort of speculate or kind of make some general statement about local authorities not carrying out their duties. Obviously, in those particular instances, there were issues with the quality of accommodation that was available, and also the duties are quite extensive because they also extend to making sure that if you've got an out of authority placement, that you've ensured that there are no Category 1 hazards, etc. But inevitably, as you start seeing numbers rising the way that there are, the availability of high-quality housing is going to become more and more squeezed, simply because there isn't very much of it, and therefore kind of local authorities are placed in a more and more difficult position of trying to find temporary accommodation, potentially at very, very short notice. So clearly there are instances in which the quality falls below what we would want to see, and there are a set of interventions that we can talk about now or later in order to try and address that. But fundamentally we need to be reducing the numbers that are in temporary accommodation as well as ensuring that it's of sufficient quality. I
just want to touch on the supported housing element as well. Now, given that that Act was once again my work,
Indeed.
And so far it's an Act of Parliament but hasn't been actually implemented, could you give us an update on progress of actually implementing what we set out to do in the last Parliament?
Yes, and indeed, I think the Homelessness Minister wrote in order to update that the consultation on the regulations of the licensing scheme will be issued in the new year, and so we will seek to make those regulations following on from that and implement the scheme as soon as possible after that. We currently have applications open. They were paused during the general election, but applications are open now for the supported housing advisory panel, and we have indeed also published the research that we did associated by and prompted by the way in which kind of your work indicated very strongly the sort of lack of understanding and knowledge about the gap between supply and demand when it came to supported housing. I've been in front of this committee in previous incarnations to talk specifically about the issues of supported housing, so they're very, very well recognised, and we also properly understand the significance that they have when it comes to addressing homelessness. Worth saying that both the Affordable Homes programme, with its kind of extra 500 million that we secured at the budget, and commitment to a future affordable homes programme that we'll set out the details of at the spending review, both of those are part of meeting that gap between supply and demand on supported housing that is so important.
The consequence of the delay is that local authorities have a duty under the Act to review the need in their area.
Indeed.
Now, I've got evidence that many local authorities are carrying out that review and then deciding that they're not going to fund really good charities that are doing a really brilliant job in supplying housing for vulnerable people. As a result, I mean, in fact, I only last week got details of one in central London where they're closing down a facility and 100 young people are going to be thrown on the streets. This is because of delay in actually making this happen, because we haven't got a clear position at the moment from the department on what the standards are due to be and what should happen. And one of the things we tried to do in the Act was to make sure that the good providers, the charitable providers, were safeguarded, and the rogue operators who exploit vulnerable people are put out of business. Unfortunately, it seems as if the good charities are being attacked, but the rogue landlords are not. So, I mean, can we get on with this? Because
yeah, I mean, I'm absolutely. I mean, I think
here.
supported housing is an absolutely critical part of solving this issue, especially for the more vulnerable, especially and those who've been rough sleeping in particular. And kind of, I'm totally aware that's the case. So, I'm really pleased we are making progress on it. It's obviously kind of very important we push on with that as rapidly as we possibly can. Obviously, can't comment on the specific instance that you mentioned, but clearly the licensing scheme is focused on ensuring that we are driving out those rogue providers and ensuring that we get high quality.
The problem is that licensing schemes that local authorities are looking at are going to be very different. If unless we've got a clear standard that is to be followed, and they're introducing their own, and therefore leading to a postcode lottery, which was not the intention.
Definitely not the intention of the Act. No, I know that from kind of the work that we did when we talked about supported housing before here.
Thank you, Bob Blackman, very much. Very useful exchange. Clive Betts.
Yeah. Permanent Secretary, how long will it be from royal assent to this Act and the first licence being issued?
I'm afraid I can't answer that. I'm afraid it really depends what the consultation reveals about the state of the regulations and exactly how complex the licensing regime is to implement.
How long is it likely to be before we get a licensing regime in place?
Well, as I say, we're going to be consulting on that in the new year, so I can't give you an exact date on that. It'll then be a number of months during which we do the consultation, then we'll need to work it through, then we'll need to lay the regulations, then we'll need to implement. So
sometime after 2026 might be the earliest.
I mean, honestly, I'd be speculating, so I'm not going to.
Yeah. It doesn't give a very good impression, does it? We've got a system here, situation, where we did an inquiry on the Levelling Up Select Committee in the last Parliament. And I think all members just sat there open-mouthed at how much money was being wasted on such an appalling system. Basically, DWP are pouring money down a black hole, and they couldn't tell us how much money or how big the hole was. I mean, we're at a time when public finances are constrained. Shouldn't we have acted quicker to actually stem the flow of money, to, as Bob Blackman just said, So rogues are exploiting.
When you've got a system like supported housing, which, as I say, is kind of something that I think is
in particular,
incredibly important to fixing this problem, I would like to do everything as quickly as possible. It's not always doable, and the general election came at the time that it did, and unfortunately, it has pushed back some of these timescales in a way that is frustrating. It doesn't reduce our commitment to making that happen and to making it happen as quickly as possible. There is no point rushing this and introducing a licensing regime that doesn't work. So we will work as quickly as possible, but no quicker than we should, in order to make sure that when we do get there, we've got there in a high-quality way.
What's your anticipation of the likely timescale? Have you got a
So I'm happy to write afterwards. I'm afraid I'm not going to be guessing on timescales and speculating in the middle of this committee, because I don't think that's a sensible thing for me to do.
Because will you set out a timetable you would like to try and hit?
I'll set out a timetable that is plausible, but as I say, long experience tells me that speculating on timetables in the middle of committee hearings isn't a very sensible thing to do, so I'm not going to do it.
Could I just ask for an assurance from you? I think it would not be unreasonable of this committee to put on the record that we would very much like you to expedite this as soon as possible, because one wouldn't want to give the impression that excuses were being made when things could be expedited more quickly.
I mean, we want to expedite it as much as possible, so very happy to accept that that's the committee's view, because it's also...
You will give this committee?
Well, it's our view that we would like to expedite it. So my evidence to you is that we will be looking to expedite this as quickly as possible.
So presumably what we're looking at here is either an 8-week or a 12-week consultation, then a period of your department needing to reflect on that, perhaps a couple of months, and then you need to lay the regulations probably another couple of months. So, I mean, it does look as though it ought to be feasible to do it sometime during the course of next year.
Yeah, October 2025.
Well, we will get that.
If you wish to make that statement, that's fine.
You're not going to comment on my proposed timetable, but let me see.
It's also not for me to decide the length of the consultation.
I was just trying to sort of see if we can get any further.
Yeah, I get it.
Can we just ask, so when do you intend to start the consultation?
I'm afraid the only information I have is that we're looking to start it as early as possible in the new year.
Well, we will certainly wish to follow that up. Chris, you wish to come in?
Just as one of the new boys on the table, could you explain how that works in terms of when you're coming up with a project plan? Because it sort of strikes me that given the complexities of this, you would have at least a basic project plan that exists. Does that exist with indicative timescales at the moment?
So I'm absolutely kind of certain, because the Minister wrote sort of committing to a New Year timetable, that it's on the basis of work from the team on what the timetable is likely to be. It's just that I don't know, I'm afraid, whether ministers are going to take the view that they would like to make this a short consultation or a long consultation. And then it sort of depends slightly how many responses you get and how complex they are to work through, exactly kind of how long it takes to then analyse those responses. And then there are a set of conditions to the question of when you actually manage to lay regulations, which is simply to do with parliamentary time.
I'm going to bring this to a halt, but you can hear the frustration of this committee.
Absolutely,
and
totally
the frustration
share it.
They want it implemented as soon as possible. So we look forward to getting your...
Good.
Your
Happy to update.
Thank you
when
very
I
much.
have more detail and not just telling you that I can't tell you.
Right, that would be really helpful. Luke Charteris.
Thank you, Permanent Secretary and colleagues, for coming. My questions are around children in B&Bs. So to start with, nearly 3,000 children were in B&Bs, and that was over the statutory 6-week period that's legally allowed as of last quarter 23-24. How many children are currently in B&Bs over this statutory limit as of this week?
I think I read that out at the start.
Yes, you did, I think.
So families in B&B, 5,910. Families in B&B over 6 weeks, 3,770.
Thank you. That tees me up nicely, because my next questions are on sort of the quality of this accommodation. An investigation early this year said that children had no space to crawl, play or use a potty in B&Bs. Won't many children's development be harmed in these settings, and has the department thought about children with SEN specifically, and could you comment on any work you've done around standards in those settings for children?
Yeah, I mean, look, the legislation is totally clear that B&B is a last resort. And it's a last resort for all of the reasons that you've set out. You know, it is a suboptimal, by some very serious degree, kind of way of accommodating families. And, you know, I'm not here to defend the use of B&B because the legislation specifically attempts to limit it and says it should be a last resort. It is being used increasingly at the moment. That is for all of the reasons that we've already talked about the kind of pressures on the system and the sort of scarcity of alternative accommodation. I'll ask Penny to come in a second because she will be able to give you a sense of the work that we do with local government when we identify that there is a particularly large number, I think it's over 5 families in a particular local authority who've been in B&B accommodation for over that limit of 6 weeks, but also to lay out what the work that the team has done on improving the quality of that accommodation, the work that we did on provision of cots in B&B accommodation. On quality, I mean, there are a set of things which I think we've already touched on the quality of temporary accommodation and the sorts of interventions that local government should be making to ensure that accommodation is adequate. In the future, there is, of course, the Renters' Rights Bill, which gives a power for us to extend the Decent Home Standard to temporary accommodation. That is another one where we'll have to consult on some of the detail of how we would implement that, because, of course, B&B accommodation in particular does differ from other accommodation in some forms, and we wouldn't want to sort of end up not being able to use B&B where it's the only option just because of that kind of regulation. But we will, certainly ministers have been very, very clear that their goal is to cover temporary accommodation with the Decent Home Standard once the Renters' Rights Bill has been implemented. Penny.
Yes, as the Permanent Secretary said, we have a condition on the Homelessness Prevention Grant, which is one of the funding streams that we give out to local authorities, which requires that a local authority which has more than 5 families in B&B over the statutory 6-week limit needs to work with us to agree a B&B elimination plan. Now, that's a local authority-owned plan, but it needs to be agreed with my team, and that will help the local authority to look at, it will be a bespoke plan that will address the particular challenges in that area which are leading to the use of B&B, but that will focus on things like better prevention of families going into B&B, improving management of the temporary accommodation stock that they have, the B&B stock, and finding alternative procurement of temporary accommodation. So we work very closely with those places to make sure that they have a robust plan in place to reduce the use of that.
I ask specifically about children's safeguarding, because these sites are not built for families in this setting. You know, they're mixed commercial purposes. You know, with 5 people using one room, it's hazardous conditions really. So what work is the department doing to set safeguarding standards for local authorities in respect to these facilities?
So the legislation, the statutory code of guidance that local authorities must follow, set out various expectations, requirements of suitability of the accommodation, and we expect local authorities to follow those. As I say, then my team will intervene and support and challenge where we have concerns about the use of B&Bs. Permanent Secretary mentioned that earlier this year we took action on cots after the all-party parliamentary group raised concerns about the provision of cots in temporary accommodation, and we amended the code of guidance to make it explicit that temporary accommodation shouldn't be considered suitable for a family with children under 2 if there wasn't enough space for a cot, and that housing authorities should support families to secure a cot where it's needed.
And finally, Chair, if I may, there's also an issue here, of course, of value for money for the taxpayer. And I was reading that many of these cases are actually going to the Ombudsman and leaving significant settlements for families. So I was wondering if you were looking at the VFM aspect of B&Bs, and also if you were tracking the Housing Ombudsman payouts overall as to the impact on VFM.
On value for money, we are, we would like to minimise the use of B&B. I mean, that is in the legislation, it is the aim. So in a sense, kind of, in all senses, not just the nightly cost, but the quality and standards, we want to have as few families in breakfast accommodation as is possible, and that is a number that we want to see coming down But it's not easy to achieve that in current circumstances, not with the kind of numbers that are presenting with the need for temporary accommodation and the limited options for accommodation that local authorities have. So overall, our assumption is that local authorities should be using as little B&B accommodation as they possibly can, but that if B&B accommodation is the only accommodation that is available for them to meet their statutory duties where it comes to providing temporary accommodation, we would consider it value for money for them to do so rather than not provide temporary accommodation. So that's the calculation that local authorities are making. I'm afraid I can't answer your question on the Ombudsman, but I'm happy to go away and check.
I can perhaps come in on the Ombudsman. Yes, so the Ombudsman obviously has a close relationship with the department. I have a regular one-to-one with the Ombudsman, and so do my team. I think it's right that I'm not sure that we go through all of the quantification that you're outlining in terms of the kind of settlements and the decisions that the Ombudsman makes, but certainly the Ombudsman take our team through the pattern of decisions that they're taking, where they're finding the stress points in local government provision and what the kind of decision findings are. So we have that shape of conversation with the Ombudsman on a regular basis, and some of the trends that you've talked about are entirely recognised and we understand in the department.
Can I remind members that they should declare their members' interests before they ask a question? As I failed to do so, I will now do so to remind everybody that of my members' interest that I am a chartered surveyor. I do own some buy-to-let and other rental properties. So thank you very much. If anybody hasn't declared their interests, please do so before their questions. Thank you very much. We now come to Nizal Kaliskan, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. And to declare, I'm Vice President of the Local Government Association, having been a council leader for a number of years before I entered Parliament earlier this year. Thank you very much to the officials for joining us. I just wanted to focus a bit more on value for money, which is why this committee is looking at the subject of homelessness and in particular temporary accommodation. You will recognise the cost to local authorities is at about, I think, £1.8 billion at the moment. Do you agree that that figure is astounding? And given that temporary accommodation should be a short-term solution, that it's not value for money at the moment?
Well, I mean, I think I go back to the answer I gave to Mr. Charteris, which is, I mean, we absolutely recognise that the costs of temporary accommodation are extremely high, and that the pressures that this is placing on local authorities, particularly some local authorities in some areas, is very challenging. That obviously we've had the case of Eastbourne, where kind of temporary accommodation costs have, caused them to come to the department to talk about financial challenges and difficulties. I hear that whenever I have conversations with council officials and chief executives, kind of the pressures that they're feeling from temporary accommodation and the pressure it's putting on their finances. Clearly, this is a situation where we would prefer funding to be going into preventative activity rather than into temporary accommodation, and where it is in temporary accommodation, for that to be temporary and for permanent accommodation to come through. We are facing a systemic challenge here in terms of the numbers involved, the difficulties with affording accommodation and the availability of accommodation. In those circumstances, I would absolutely want to see local authorities providing temporary accommodation rather than not providing temporary accommodation. And in that sense, that's the judgment that we're sort of making here. I think we all think it would be better value for money for this money to be either less or focused on preventative activity. But in the event that a family has need, I would want a local authority to meet that need through providing that temporary accommodation. And unfortunately, that's the reason, the numbers that are involved here is the reason why the costs have gone to that level.
Yes, and I'm sure you recognise the point that I'm making is not that people should be left out on the street, because not only is that the wrong thing to do, but it also goes against the statutory duty of the local authority. But given that it's £1.8 billion for taxpayers, they often remark that that money would be better spent on providing housing for a more long-term solution. And I was asking the questions so that partly so I could make the point, but also I wanted some reassurance that the department understands that's where their priority should be, around long-term sustainable housing.
Yes, we do. Yes, we do.
And not using taxpayers'
money.
money.
Yes, we do.
Because even though the money might not directly be coming from central government, the burden is on local authorities.
No, we absolutely do. I mean, I think, you're not going to find a single sort of person, this panel, who kind of would in any way thinks that the current situation is a situation that they wanted ever to see and wanted to sustain.
And do you also recognise that actually the term temporary accommodation is in many ways quite misleading, because there are thousands and tens of thousands of people across this country who are placed in what is called temporary accommodation, but for years on end. And more recently, because of the housing challenges that you spoke about, actually they're not being placed even in the area that they find themselves homeless in, that they are being sent hours and hours away from their hometown. And actually there is something fundamentally broken about the housing market in the country.
Perhaps we can take this on a systemic basis, and we should return to your question about out-of-area placements, because it is important. I mean, I think, as Sarah Healey has said, the departmental perspective on temporary accommodation is that it is a necessary part of the system. But temporary accommodation is a part of a system which is needed on this scale, as it currently is, because systemically we have a complex set of drivers that are pushing homelessness up. And as we set out at the start, the position 2017-18 was very different to that which we've seen post-pandemic. I think we absolutely accept that building housing supply and seeing real growth there is absolutely critical to reducing homelessness in the long term. And that's exactly why the government has a 1.5 million housing target. It's exactly why you've seen at the budget the initial investment of 500 million in the Affordable Homes Programme. Yeah. And that is in order to kickstart that provision, and particularly to think about the right end of the market, as Sarah was saying earlier.
That's really helpful. And I'm sorry to interrupt, because I think we might be coming on to house building as well. But I just wanted to just refer to this 1.8 figure that I know you absolutely recognise is a burden on public finances. But it is a burden on local authorities.
It is.
And it is the thing, in most cases for local authorities, that will tip them over the edge into bankruptcy. And I'm interested in the department's view of acknowledging the particular burden of temporary accommodation costs for councils.
I mean, Catherine is an absolute expert on the kind of issues of local government finance, so she will say a bit more about our understanding of the pressures on overall local government budgets. But I should start by saying, when I came to the department as the Permanent Secretary last February, the conversations I had with local government chief executives and senior officials were all about children's social care, SEN, as the kind of major pressures on their budgets. Now it is about temporary accommodation. So that is something we are extremely conscious of, and the fact that on top of those other systemic growing demand pressures on local government, temporary accommodation has been a major increasing burden, which is causing really very, very significant challenges for many.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, in terms of adding to that, I agree with what Sarah has said. Children's services, special educational need, and those have been underlying pressures for some time. It's certainly the case that over the last 1 to 2 years, in conversations with councils, which we do confidentially when people are facing some issues, as you'll understand, and in looking at the underlying drivers, the underlying outturn, which the department does publish, you can see that temporary accommodation is becoming a more prominent issue. It is just a fact that it is slightly smaller quantum-wise compared to some of those other budgets, but nonetheless you're right about the change in the dynamics there. And I think that's part of the reason why the government has prioritised homelessness and prevention grant uplifts. And you'll have seen in the budget the allocation of over 230 million additional money going into homelessness services, which is partly in recognition of this immediate challenge.
Yeah, I think it's also worth saying it's not only the extra funding in a very sort of tight spending settlement in a difficult fiscal context, which I think underlines the importance of this and the importance the recognition of it across government, and the fact that the overall budget over and above what's in the local government finance settlement is now almost £1 billion for homelessness prevention grant.
Because that preventative work had halted or reduced over the last few years. That's right, isn't it?
Well, I think it's probably worth saying that perhaps like the Homelessness Reduction Act, the Homelessness Prevention Grant actually can be spent on all sorts of aspects of addressing homelessness. And indeed, one of the challenges that we're facing is that because of the nature of the pressures of temporary accommodation, there is less preventative work and more responsive provision of temporary accommodation being spent out of those funds. I think what we're trying to say is that the increase in it has definitely been focused on trying to recognise the costs that are falling on local government and try and address some of those. Equally, we've set out that we want to put some other homelessness grants together in the local government finance settlement to give local government a bit more flexibility in how those funds are spent, very much along the lines that we've committed to this committee and others before about giving greater flexibility to local government.
And, you know, just for context, as somebody who was a council leader, you get the homelessness grant every year and you have some flexibility in how that can be used. And it goes into a budget. And broadly speaking, you have to make some choices. You either say, actually, I'm going to use some of this money in order to help people put a deposit down so they can get out of Airbnbs and into more long-term accommodation. And increasingly, that is the pressure and the choice that local authorities have to be making because of the numbers of people in temporary accommodation. Or you do the preventative work, which we've just spoken about, which is we are going to have a team in place so that we identify the families that are at risk of homelessness before they get into debt and before they are evicted. The truth is that local authorities only have so much capacity, and because of that, the latter, in terms of the preventative work, has basically stopped happening. So my final question, because I know others want to come on, particularly to talk about the LHA rate, which is having the direct impact on budgets, is really just the final word on that preventative work. And going forward, I'm asking for some reassurance that the department, in their conversations with local authority and the way that they fund them, will re-emphasise the importance of prevention so that we can see the TA rates across the country come down.
I can absolutely give you that assurance, but I can go further than that and say that we are actively looking at ways in which we can ensure that we are incentivising and supporting local government to move more of the funding into preventative activity than reactive.
Can I just ask you, either Ms. Celia or Ms. Francis, arising from Nestle Kalaskan's question, you mentioned Eastbourne. Is Eastbourne a one-off? And if not, what are the criteria that apply for special payments?
So, Jeffrey, I think we've discussed some of these issues about exceptional financial support before. And for new members of the committee, the department's policies, we tend not to go through the details of any conversations we're having with local councils, which are confidential until when we reach a point where we give a council exceptional financial support. Then, of course, we have historically always published the outcome of that. Historically, in previous years, we have seen a number of councils, and all of those exceptional financial support arrangements have been published. So I don't think that particular example is a single council that I can kind of point to and say it stands alone. What we have seen coming forward over recent years is a combination of factors that have driven councils to come to us, ranging in some cases from service pressures and particular issues with the constitution of their budgets, in other cases to much more complex issues, and in some cases some failure that's happened at local authority level, which you'll be well aware of as a committee. In terms of how we take the programme forward, what we do, we've published our exceptional financial support principles previously. What we do is we ask councils to make sure that they have reviewed everything that is reasonable and available for them to scrutinise in terms of their own local choices. We have then historically offered people a range of capitalisation support to help them meet costs, and the government has recently announced that the terms of capitalisation are going to be more relaxed and less costly than the previous government did. But we will take everybody through a uniform system in quite an involved way.
That's helpful to clarify that. Thank you very much. Clive Betts.
Yes, can I just follow up briefly on that one point? I mean, the government changed the terms in which councils can borrow.
Correct.
But it's also said that councils shouldn't borrow to fund revenue from next year. So how are you going to do this bailing out of councils if you're not allowed to capitalise?
So I mean, firstly, at the moment, councils will have to wait for the local government finance settlement, as you know, in order to fully process where they are. We are expecting to continue to work with councils on a range of tools, including capitalisation, when they are in exceptional need. But there is a wider situation for what you think all councils across the country do, where they're bound by all the usual sort of regulations.
The Treasury is going to allow you to capitalise revenue in exceptional circumstances, are they?
Well, I will certainly be asking the Treasury and my ministers for decisions on that in due course when we make those decisions, Mr. Betts.
I'll come back to that in due course. Can we just come into the issue of the local housing allowance?
Just before we do, I sense that Nizel Calliscan has got a question on the specific point.
Specifically on the capitalisation. So will it be in exceptional circumstances, and will each local authority have to approach the department for that? Or is the intention to allow a more generic model that allows local authorities to just capitalise?
I think I can refer the committee best to the fully published document that we put out last week, the Local Government Policy Statement, which is really worth looking at this. It covers all of the financial principles in sort of words rather than in numerical terms, which is what we'll do in the Local Government Finance Settlement. We put this out last week. Covers the description about what we will do in terms of exceptional financial support and the basic capital framework. For example, on capital finance, it acknowledges that we'll extend the flexible use of capital receipts to 2030.
That's very helpful to draw our attention to that. Thank you.
And if I could just say, the reason I asked that, and I will refamiliarise myself, is because local authorities are often not forward in talking about the challenges that they are facing, and you know, if we're honest, often their financial situation is politicised, which puts them off from being as communicative as they need to be. And we don't want to find ourselves in a position where local authorities are holding back. Having said that, I don't believe in a blank chequebook. That's not helpful, I don't think, in terms of value for money for the taxpayer. But I do think it's welcome that the department is thinking about capitalisation to help get over what will be a difficult period for local authorities.
In exceptional financial support circumstances, and I think the point I would like to make is it may be a hazard of my role, but local authorities certainly talk to me and share with me at great length the pressures of their financial position.
I would expect nothing less.
Right. Thank you for reminding us, Chair. I'm a Vice President of the Local Government Association as well. The local housing allowance rates, they were frozen for a long time, but 2023 they were increased to the point where the estimate was that they basically cover 30%, 30th percentile of local market rents. In other words, that they should pay for the rent on 3 out of 10 appropriately sized private rented properties. But that was a year ago. We've now had quite large increases in rents in the private sector. So what's the latest estimate of the number of properties which are now covered by LHA rates?
Do you want to ask James Wolfe from
yes, probably, yes.
or Jenan, Hasan from DWP? James, do you want to have a start? Or which I don't mind which of you. Yeah. One of you.
The figure I have is that 45% of households in receipt of LHA have a shortfall. It's a shortfall between their contractual rent.
And that's gone up since the last time the rates were increased, has it?
From August 2024.
Right, so what was the figure back in May 23?
Don't have that figure, I'm afraid.
Helpful just to have the increase. Yeah. So, what analysis is being done of the extent to which homelessness is driven by people not being able to afford the LHA rents in their area? The rents in their area with the LHA rates.
Yeah. So, the LHA decision at the last fiscal event didn't happen in isolation. So I think clearly increasing LHA has a positive impact in getting more money into tenants' pockets to pay their rents. But there were a series of other decisions at the budget. So the fair repayment rate to reduce the amount that some people have deducted from their universal credit, the extension of the household support fund, and the extension of discretionary housing payments. So I think we would say, thinking about this in the round, the best place to look is the distributional analysis that the Treasury publish at every fiscal event that actually captures the impact of all the changes at the budget rather than each individual measure.
So there's no specific analysis of the impact on LHA rates not being able to pay for many rents in their area has on homelessness? There's no analysis.
The department does a range of modelling of differential rates of different things, different contributions that different amounts of money being paid to different sources in different ways makes, all of which we provide in the round to support decision making by ministers.
Right, so what analysis has been done there, the extent to which if LHA rates were increased, so they were back to the 30% level, it would actually reduce expenditure on temporary accommodation by enabling more people to actually get a permanent home in the private sector?
I think the challenge here is that there are so many different elements to this that if you increased when ministers are taking decisions, they're taking them in the round in the sort of broad fiscal context, that if you decided that thing, you might have also decided something else which would actually kind of put rates using temporary accommodation up in other circumstances.
You can present a choice where everything else being equal, this is what the impact of increasing LHA rates is.
Yeah, but except nothing is equal, and and ministers make determinations on the basis of a range of policy advice.
Then a decision on LHA rates then is simply subjective rather than objective.
So I think if I may... Sorry.
Yes, of course.
So I think if you look at the last budget, it's a good example of this. So we know from talking to local authorities that when people have access to the Household Support Fund, for whatever purpose that might be, they often tell us that makes it easier for them to pay their rent because they've had some other pressure on their household removed. So what we can't tell you is if ministers had decided to spend more on the LHA, what consequences that would have had elsewhere in the system and what the impact of that would have been. So that's why we tend to look at these fiscal events in the round. We give ministers the best analysis that we can. So obviously, as you say, all of the things being equal, if you put more money into LHA, that will have a positive impact. But what we need ministers to do is look at the whole package at a fiscal event, and then they can decide what they think is the best way forward with that best analysis that we can give them.
It is fairly subjective then at the end.
Well, ultimately, it's a judgment about what is affordable against kind of a whole range of different options.
Increasing LHA rates has a positive impact on keeping down homelessness and reducing expenditure on temporary accommodation.
All I'm saying is that in the round, all I'm saying is that in the round, kind of obviously sort of the overall numbers in temporary accommodation might be affected by a fiscal decision that was taken somewhere else. That's all.
We're getting a long way behind. Go quickly, Nezel.
I will be quick. So, according to the Local Government Association, in 2023, local authorities subsidised for about £200 million compared to £40 million 10 years previously, because the DWP only subsidised local authorities based on the 2011 LHA rates. So you can quantify it. I understand the point about general ministers making decisions on the whole, but the point about LHA rates not meeting the cost of what a property might be means that local authorities are having to subsidise. That's right, isn't it?
So is it worth talking about that? That's a slightly different point about temporary accommodation subsidy, and that is the kind of thing where we would point to our general increase in funding to local government in order to kind of look at how we've addressed that, which is slightly different from what people can afford in the private rented sector as a result of the level of LHA that is built into the benefit system. Catherine, do you want to talk about?
Yes, in the sense that the LHA is there, as Sarah has said, for the wider benefit system, but if a household is then declared homeless and then switches into the local authorities' care and jurisdiction, all the points we were raising earlier, at that point, DWP then shift funding source, in a sense, to the temporary accommodation subsidy, TA subsidy as it's known, and it is that is picked up in the NAO report, which talks around that rate having been stable for some time. But then, as Sarah says, what happens in that context is that the local authority, we know, are using their resources, and we factor that in when we consider about local authorities' resources.
Thank you. Rebecca Paul.
Thank you. So firstly, I'd just like to declare that I'm a county councillor at Surrey County Council. I'm going to move on to out-of-area placements. So we know that some local authorities struggle to place households within their local area, and the number of households, according to the NAO report, placed out of area rose from 23,450 in quarter 3 of 2018-19 to 33,350 in quarter 3 2023-24. So an increase of 42%. how far away from their home areas are some households likely to be living?
Would you like to put this one up?
Yes, we don't have the data to say exactly how far people are living away from their local authority area, although we do hear of, aware of evidence of families being placed sometimes at a distance from the local area. But we are very clear, and the legislation and code of guidance are very clear, that local authorities should, as far as possible, avoid placing households out of their borough. But in some areas, there's a limited supply of suitable temporary accommodation, as we've discussed this afternoon, and it's sometimes necessary, therefore, for households to be placed outside of the area. But that should, again, be as a last resort.
I think it's worth saying that one of the conclusions of the NAO report was specifically about us making improvements to our data on out-of-area placements, and we are, we're looking at how we can meet this recommendation. It's a recommendation we think is really important. This is obviously a significant area of concern, especially as numbers rise, that might continue to be a problem that is increasing year on year, and therefore I know that there is work underway with our analysts to look at how we can have better data to improve the transparency about out-of-area placements, and indeed improve the information that is available to local government about people and where they have been placed and who has been placed in their area, because that is currently a gap that we recognise and are working to fill.
Presumably, Ms. Healey, your new system, homeless case level information collection, could do this.
Well, HClick data at the moment can map when somebody goes out of area from a local authority. What we are finding hard methodologically at the moment is to join that up with the sort of data from the recipient authority, if you like, and make the connection there. There are also just a few data issues, because in some cases it's a very small number of people, so there are some sort of issues around data protection sort of side of things, and thinking about how that's used. But the HClick data has just been a huge shift forward over the last sort of 5 to 10 years in how we measure case level data. So we're looking to use that as much as we can. And we've also been doing a project recently connecting homelessness data with data from other public services as well. So, for example, connecting with health data to see if we can get a greater understanding of what's driving homelessness. So for us, building the data set is absolutely critical and been a real focus for the last decade. But as Sarah has said, we need to keep working on what's possible to build.
And it's worth adding as well that, as the NAO report pointed out, that in the latest data, it's 80% of those out of area placements are being made by London local authorities, and as the NAO reported from discussions with London councils, those are mostly still within the London area. And there was some research published just last month from the University of Nottingham based on FOI data from local authorities, which also suggested the same thing, that the London placements, whilst out of the London borough, were within London overall.
Thank you. So I think we would all really welcome the work you're doing on that, because we obviously appreciate the importance of that data. I'm really keen to just validate my understanding of something and see whether you think it rings true and what you think needs to happen if it is true. So when I've spoken to various councillors and council officials, it seems that we've got the situation where we've got lots of people being placed out of area because there's insufficient accommodation for whatever reason in that specific borough. But equally, you then can have a look and see that other borough councils are sending in the same amount of people into the area, which seems like a bit of a perverse situation, because we all know that actually sending people out of area is just dreadful for them. You know, children have to move schools, medical care isn't consistent, relationships with family, friends, at work, can all break down. Now, I understand, obviously, that a lot of this will come about because different local authorities have different arrangements, but I'd be interested in your thoughts whether this is the case and what you think can be done to try and sort of address this perverse situation. Because clearly we want local people as much as possible to have first dibs effectively on the accommodation in their local area, because that minimises the harms. That's to Ms Hobman.
Yeah, I mean, well, just to say, certainly anecdotally, I am told this a lot. So kind of it is a problem that is flagged, and it's clearly, as you say, just does not seem like right at all that you've got kind of basically boroughs sort of swapping people when it's clearly better for people to stay as close as possible to their home.
And we would certainly, that's the kind of thing that my team would work on with a local authority, particularly to help them think about how they can improve their TA procurement models. So, for example, some of the work we've done is to help them to think about and invest in long-term private sector leasing so that they can keep placements within their own local borough. So it's definitely something that we would work with them to improve. But as we said earlier, it's fundamentally driven by the lack of supply of temporary accommodation. So that's the way that we can fix this, is by improving that supply.
I think it's also worth saying that kind of longer term investment in sort of long term leasing and improving the availability, so that you don't end up with a situation where because of an emergency you place somebody out of area and then the local authority next door has another emergency and finds a slot there, but then you don't want to move people again, and so you end up with this sort of like situation arising. Is long term local government funding and predictability of funding, which is obviously something that the NAO report refers to the importance of as well, and something that we're absolutely committed to. We unfortunately have one more year of single-year settlement for local government, but beyond that, a multi-year spending review will allow us to give local government a longer-term planning horizon in order to be able to meet some of these needs and make decisions that will, have effect for the long term instead of for the short term.
And we see this issue as well with sort of out of area looked after children. So it's exactly the same situation we find, but it does make me wonder whether or not we should be looking at some kind of centralised coordination. I know we've moved very much to this sort of devolved model, but actually this can be the downside of that when we sort of don't have the central coordination, just to make sure that the outcomes we're getting are actually sensible and local people are filling the local accommodation.
I mean, I'd sort of be cautious of too much central government involvement in what ultimately needs to be a statutory responsibility of local government, and which is very much based on individual circumstances and individual need that they see in front of them day on day. But clearly Penny's team that work closely with local government on trying to make this work better will always look at ways in which they can improve coordination on the ground between local government and how local authorities and how they work together.
And one of the things we might do, for example, is to share good practice between local authorities and to facilitate conversations between local authorities if it's brought to our attention or we look at the data and we're aware that there does seem to be issues in out of borough placement. So that's something we can do.
And obviously better linking data for that is going to help to just manifest to local authorities and manifest to us where that is a particular problem.
And sorry, my last question. Or do you want me to move on?
I want to quickly get Rachel Gilmore in on this.
Okay. I keep on hearing this anecdotal evidence expression rather too often in front of this Public Accounts Committee. And I think that if you focused more on having data and case studies and strategies which were evidence-based and you had the proper data, you wouldn't have to use the terms anecdotal evidence all the time. I make a suggestion that happens.
Yeah, I mean, as I think I said it once in relation to just the fact that I agreed with Ms Paul that it is certainly a story that I hear that this is a problem, and I think Catherine set out at length kind of what we're doing to improve the data in this area, precisely as recommended by the NAO's report.
Brilliant, thank you. Clive Betts.
Yes, just coming on to the issue of coordination between government departments. Now, your department, Permanent Secretary, obviously leads on the issue of homelessness, but you've got help from, I understand, 15 cross-government boards, which have at least an element of interest in homelessness. What does it all add up, all that talking in those offices, to the actual production of a better strategy and better outcomes?
So obviously the NAO's report reflected on the situation as it was at the time when they gathered their evidence. I think it's worth saying that the focus on coordination of action on homelessness is really now the interministerial group on homelessness that the Deputy Prime Minister chairs, and the officials group that supports that Catherine chairs, and that is where the concentration of effort and energy is on a cross-government strategy involving a multiple range of departments to tackle homelessness.
And are there outcomes that you want to see from that?
Yes, we're going to produce a long-term strategy that the government has committed to, and it is the one that precisely the NAO made a recommendation should be produced that involves the relevant government departments and will be set out next year and will involve working through both metrics and ways in which we will measure our progress against those.
Thank you. Of course, just one question on that further. Just in terms of joined-up approach, one of the complaints local authorities make to me is that they realise they have to put families in temporary accommodation, then they look for hotels, and they suddenly find the Home Office come in and has bid even higher rates for the hotel they were looking at. What is being done to stop that from happening?
I mean, this is an issue that I discuss with my counterpart at the Home Office regularly, because it is, again, I hear the same thing that you do about this, and it is clearly an issue, and we've recognised that it's an issue because the Home Office have made a decision not, if local government is already using accommodation in a particular area, then they will not use it. But clearly you've got here a situation where you've got two sets of statutory duties, two people that are trying to, two organisations that are trying to meet them. Local government, when it comes to people who they owe a homelessness duty to, and the Home Office with its own statutory duty to accommodate asylum seekers who would otherwise be destitute. And obviously this report, plus the report that the NAO did earlier this year on asylum accommodation, have pointed out that those can clash occasionally and that there can therefore be issues raised. I think
the Home Office has got more money to offer higher rates, hasn't it?
And I think I would also say that the coordination in the past between the Home Office and local government has, and they have acknowledged this, not being what it should be, and they are working very, very actively to improve that, to improve the consultation that they do with local government. They are producing a new strategy for asylum accommodation and a new approach on that, which is more locally led and reduces competition, but also looks at actually how you provide more supply through the kind of asylum accommodation system as well. I obviously kind of recognise that people will have instances and examples where that has not worked as well as it should. We encourage local government always to flag, both with us and the Home Office, where that has not worked as it should do, to try and eliminate examples of that. But inevitably, when you've got a scarcity of accommodation, you will have some issues there.
And it will be better.
That is the commitment.
We're always pleased to see that your department follows up recommendations from our previous hearings, and we did draw attention to this issue of competition from the Home Office.
You did.
Asylum.
Yes.
So you've said two things which I'm sure will lead to further questioning, two bits of very interesting future policy making. So to start that progress, I'm going to ask Anna Dixon to start, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. And before I do, I just refer to my register of interest that I am a landlord. So I'd like to turn my questions, I think, to Catherine. I gather you're the chair of the newly formed cross-government task force. It's obviously got a slightly different name now. And I'm really just very keen to hear about what its priorities are going to be. I mean, given that it is trying to potentially cover some 15 cross-government issues that were previously identified, is it going to have a similar broad scope or a tighter focus?
Yes, thank you. So, the cross-government ministerial group, chaired by the Deputy Prime Minister, and I convene the official equivalent of the same. The real task for these groups is to build towards the strategy that Sarah has alluded to, which we expect to produce next year. And the aim, in terms of, if you think about the departments who are represented in that conversation, we've got the Ministry of Justice, DWP, Department of Health, Department for Education, Home Office, Office of Veterans, along with Treasury and Cabinet Office. It's a proper cross-cutting group. And what we want to be able to do is to address the underlying causes of homelessness and build a strategy that really sort of addresses the government's manifesto commitment to get back on track with dealing with homelessness. But we also want to synthesise departmental work so we can think about alleviation of homelessness and think not only about the sort of underlying housing issues that we've talked about, but also how public services come together around individuals. So exact outcome not yet set, but the aim of this group is to produce a proper joint strategy.
Thank you for that. You wouldn't be surprised that I might follow up on health. So I think data suggests that about 45% of homeless people have also got a mental health diagnosis, for example. So would you see the ministerial task force actually coming up with recommendations specifically, for example, for the NHS 10-year plan or for the Department of Health and Social Care, you know, recognising that they have a role, for example, in better support for mental health, or the same would be true drug and alcohol services. So I think about 20% of people starting treatment in drug and alcohol services have no home of their own. So just sort of really trying to pick an example of what difference this cross-departmental working is going to make.
So I think the difference it's going to make is to have a conversation that is focused on the homelessness outcome and to say, what is it can we do across different agencies, across different departments, which alleviates homelessness and relieves homelessness. I think it'll be a decision for ministers exactly as you say, questions about mental health or drug and alcohol interact with homelessness provision. But precisely the reason why we've got that range of actors around the table is so that they can have those conversations and the evidence presented to them in a way that is directed towards homelessness so that they can make those decisions collectively. We have, of course, historically done lots with colleagues on the health side, including on drug and alcohol. But for the future, I would just anticipate some of what the NAO report highlighted, which was us bringing homelessness through sort of 15 different groups, the power of having everybody together to consider and make proper choices, which will be for ministers about what they want to prioritise. That's where the change lies, I think.
Do you sound confident that this might do a better job at tackling some of these issues than the previous sort of slightly more diffuse work across these different boards?
Well, I'm certainly confident that it can bring the right set of decision makers together to address the government's priority in the manifesto.
I suppose the acid test to Ms Dixon's question is this going to do away with some of those 15 different cross-departmental government bodies that Clive Betts was talking about?
I think it might be a teensy bit of a red herring, the sort of focus on 15 committees. I think the point here is that when you've got a group that looks at asylum accommodation, you would actually want them to think about homelessness. It would be a bad thing if it didn't think about the homelessness consequences of the work that it did. Equally, if you have a board that is governing the Department of Health and cross-government work on mental health, you want them to think about homelessness as part of that. The point that Catherine's making is that the government has a manifesto commitment on tackling homelessness, and this group is where all of the work that is specifically focused on homelessness is coming together across government.
Okay, thank you. And just one fun thing on this, and then I just want to ask something on data. Will it, the timing of that suggests, would it be able to feed into the spending review?
So we would certainly expect to have a proper cross-government conversation, as we would about any policy area, actually, not to belittle this at all, feeding into a multi-year spending review about what the best value for money and the best levers are. And we would expect that to be decided in exactly the normal way as usual, feeding through to a multi-year SR.
And I see in the report it talks about the Centre for Homelessness impact. So will it be drawing in sort of data and evidence to inform sort of what best buys there are in homelessness and what is actually effective?
So I may bring Penny Hobman in on this, but we have a particular expert group that supports the cross-cutting policy group in order to bring in a range of real experts from the sector, ranging both from those that we sponsor and have a direct relationship at the moment, and also leading charities in the sector and other academics. Penny, do you want to add anything more, or is it necessary?
So in addition to the expert group that Catherine mentioned, we also have a lived experience forum to make sure that the development of the strategy is informed by voices of those who experience it. And then in relation to the work that we have contracted out to the Centre for Homelessness Impact, they're doing two things for us. One is a system-wide evaluation, which should give us some of its first findings early next year, which we hope can therefore be fed into development of the strategy. We've also contracted them to deliver a series of test and learn projects, and the evidence from those will come over the next couple of years, and then also can feed into the sort of operational delivery of the future strategy.
Thank you, Anna Dixon, very helpful. Chris Kane, please.
Thank you, Chair. As a Scottish MP and a Scottish Council leader up until the election, I'm sort of used to dealing with this, with the Scottish Government through Costas, so it's interesting to come down and see it with the UK Government. And I note that Each of the UK devolved administrations has an overarching homelessness strategy or action plan, but by contrast there isn't one in England, and that seems to be despite the NEO talking about it and also this committee asking for it in 2017. I'm just wondering, why isn't there a strategy or a target for tackling statutory homelessness, and when would you expect to have that in place?
As we've set out at this hearing, the government is now committed to having a long-term strategy to tackle homelessness and a set of metrics in that strategy. The NAO covers the background to the existence or otherwise of an England-based strategy in its report, and I don't have anything to add to what it says.
And just, sometimes important just for us to look back, why hasn't there been one? What's your...
I think the best place to go to, I think it's paragraph 213, is
212 and 213.
Yeah, I think they're your best descriptions. I don't have anything to add to them.
So, okay, that doesn't really give me an answer, but okay. And in terms of the interaction between the devolved administrations and tackling homelessness, I think Penny talked about, sharing best practice among local authorities. What lessons are you learning from the devolved devolved administrations? How is that all working? Because there is an awful lot of different approaches in the devolved nations, and hopefully there's things we can all learn together. So could you talk to that for a little while, please?
Yeah, we talk regularly at official level with our counterparts in the devolved administrations. So, as you know, the legislative framework is different, but many of the drivers of homelessness are exactly the same things: housing affordability as one of the key drivers. So we do talk regularly to our colleagues to share good information. We have had meetings as well previously of ministers responsible for homelessness across the UK government and the devolved nations, again to collaborate where there are shared challenges and think about how we can share best practice around solutions too.
That's sort of explaining what the ability to talk to one another is. I'm just wondering what lessons you've actually learned. What have you got from these discussions with the devolved nations?
Some of the things that we have learned from each other have been about, for example, in Scotland, some of the things that they have implemented that we've learned about what they've experienced. The Welsh, you will know, have recently consulted on some amendments to their legislation. So the sorts of things that we'd understand from them is what they're experiencing from some of the things that they're doing differently than we've done here.
And now you've got all that information, feeding it into funnel to learn lessons and put them into practice here. Is that all happening, or is it just a talking shop where you're talking about what each other's doing? But we have got different approaches that can be helpful. So are we actually taking that learning and are we doing something with it?
It would certainly all feed into all of the evidence that we are gathering to then consider and feed into the development of the strategy that we've discussed this afternoon.
Thank you.
Healey, in producing this strategy, can we take it as read that it will be properly costed and funded by central government? Because it would be intolerable to produce a strategy that put yet further pressure on local government finance.
Obviously I don't make the decisions about kind of precisely what the content of a strategy would be, and indeed kind of the precise timing in relationship to the spending review, but our expectation is that the strategy would draw on the results of the spending review in setting out how we're going to address homelessness for the next few years.
Thank you. It's not a vote. It's so we will carry on. It's just the sitting is being suspended for 10 minutes. So let's just carry on. Sarah Hall, your time has come.
Yes, thank you. Hello. I'm going to look at the 2022 rough sleeping strategy in a little bit more detail, if that's okay. And the focus that it's had.
I want to just, Sarah, just pause a second until the bell goes off, I think, so that we can hear it clearly on the... I don't know how long it's going to be.
There was an issue with this house bells, wasn't it? So now it's maybe too much.
We think probably another minute. Right,
Oh.
there you are, your time has really come. Sarah Hall.
Okay. Thank you, Chair. So just to repeat a little bit louder now, the bells will stop. I'm going to look at the 2022 rough sleeping strategy and the activity, the kind of cross-departmental activity, the government and the homeless sector. So my question really is to Penny, you knew this was coming. What is the evidence that your rough sleeping strategy is helping to focus activity across government and within the homelessness sector?
I think the 2022 strategy, which was obviously the strategy of the previous government, which was focused on how the then government could deliver the manifesto commitment to end rough sleeping. I think it was very useful, that manifesto commitment and the work that went into the strategy in, as we've been talking about this afternoon, focusing collective minds across government on the shared interest and the shared kind of contributions that government departments had to contributing to ending rough sleeping, recognising that the drivers of rough sleeping range across a lot of remits of different government departments, so thinking collectively about how the system comes together to address those drivers.
Okay. I think it's probably worth saying, however, that the kind of like the action that was set out in the rough sleeping strategy, it's quite difficult to sort of judge how well it might have worked in different circumstances, but the sort of winds driving increases in rough sleeping have been kind of serious, and so therefore kind of the numbers have obviously been going in the wrong direction.
Yeah. So just take it down a step forwards then. So in terms of that work and what we can learn from it, and in terms of, to what extent was there data sharing and monitoring systems, and that was shared across departments? What was the frequency? What was in terms of tracking progress, the identification of emerging trends, points, identifying where things aren't working ahead of time? How frequently was that employed?
One of the things that the 2022 rough sleeping strategy introduced was the rough sleeping data framework, which was a set of indicators, 8 indicators that relate to the definition of ending rough sleeping that was set out in that strategy, that it should be prevented where possible, and that it should be brief, rare and non-recurrent. So we developed a set of data indicators that then map against those 4 elements of the definition. We published those, we gather management information from local authorities and we published those, and that was something that we then reviewed regularly in a cross-government officials group that met quarterly, and then it could look at both the data, what the data was showing us across those indicators, but also on delivery of the commitments that were set out in that strategy. Yep. So that was the forum in which we took that forward. Obviously that was under the previous government and has now been succeeded by Catherine's.
Did that include things like capturing the wider issues? So we talk about the health, wider determinants, health, mental health, benefits issues, and how reactive, how interactive was it? So, you said you published the data and that's great, but in terms of local authorities being able to utilise that data and kind of hone in on their specific patches, how responsive was that?
I think the data is a really big step forward in helping local authorities to really understand what's driving the rough sleeping in their particular area. So some of the data points do include, for example, where people have left hospital and have gone into rough sleeping. For example, it helps local authorities to understand where the rough sleepers, which we see is a combination of people who are new to rough sleeping, people who cycle and return to rough sleeping, and people who have been long-term rough sleeping and maybe haven't accepted service offers in the past. So I think it has been, and the feedback from local authorities, that has been really helpful in playing back to them and encouraging them to think about what they need to do different.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but partly the publication of this was something that was called for. Yeah, even though it's not official statistics, kind of we publish it because we think it's valuable information for people to be able to use.
Yeah, and it was something that the previous incarnation of this committee had been very keen for us to publish.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And just one final thing, if I may, quickly. How might this rush sleeping strategy then inform a wider strategy on homelessness? Sorry.
So I think a lot of the things that Catherine talked about earlier in terms of making sure that we can have a shared evidence base across government departments so that we're all starting from the same point of understanding of the interactions between homelessness, rough sleeping and various other responsibilities of government is something that we learned from that strategy and we're taking forward in the work now. Don't know if there's anything.
I think it's exactly that point. It's the opportunity to think about an issue in a focused way, but bringing all of the parties together across government is a very valuable learning point from that way of doing things.
In terms of the data, though, is it better, thinking about how useful the data is going to be? Is it real-time information that different departments can then draw upon and react accordingly, or is it a bit of a lag between when the data is published and?
There's a mixture. The HCLIC data is published, which is official statistics and goes through a very detailed quality assurance process. That comes at slightly more of a lag, whereas the management information on rough sleeping goes through a less of a quality assurance process, so it's more timely. So I think we use a mixture of both those sorts of data, but also there's other sources of information, and that might be qualitative information that we gather from my teams who work out externally facing with local authorities.
Is there anything you think that didn't work with the last strategy that you think that you won't be doing next time as we look to shape it and improve it going forwards? Or?
I mean, the actual content of any future strategy is really not a decision for us. I suppose we'd sort of reflect on the fact that kind of there were a bunch of sort of challenges with implementing the rough sleeping strategy just from the kind of context, so we'd want to consider kind of whether there's anything we've learned from that.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you, Sarah Hall. Nesl Callisker.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'm going to focus on the supply of housing. It's a very just open question just to begin with. Do you agree that the housing crisis demonstrates a broken housing system nationally, and that it's fundamentally caused by the lack of supply of housing?
I don't think it's really for me to kind of describe the housing system as broken. I mean, I'll point to kind of what all of my sort of like the politicians that we work for and the ministers that we work for have said about the housing crisis and kind of their ambition when it comes to housing supply. I think we've already said in this hearing several times that we think that scarcity is clearly a contributory factor for the numbers who are currently homeless.
And in terms of housing supply, I just want to focus a little bit on the role that local authorities can play as part of that supply. Over the last few months, probably 18 months, there seems to be a particular challenge around viability of pipeline of houses. I wanted to get a sense from you what your understanding is of how many projects are being held up because of viability. I don't need numbers, I just want to get a sense of to what degree is this a local authority problem, or is it just actually a broader supply issue?
I think there's a range of issues with housing supply. I don't think I'd ever kind of point to one in particular. We're obviously aware of the issues on viability and engaging very actively with local government about kind of areas where viability is getting in the way of, for instance, the kind of use of Section 106 money in order to develop sites, and that's something we're working on with them very, very actively. It is also something which is obviously critical to making policy on social housing for the future, and the work that the other parts of the department, of my department, have done on both planning policy and also on making changes on social housing to try and raise the percentage of supply of the new supply that the government's committed to.
Is it your understanding that projects that were viable a few years ago are now no longer viable for a variety of reasons? We
have been engaging with local government about viability issues, yes.
And then with that in mind, local authorities, certainly according to the LGA, have called for a variety of measures. For example, preferential rates from the Public Works Loan Board, which might help them to get viability in place for a number of their schemes. And I mention that in particular because there are suggestions that the amount of money that is saved overall over the long term is far greater than what is spent through borrowing from the Public Works Loan Board, for example. So I wanted to get a sense from you of how much of that is being explored through the department.
I mean, obviously, that's a kind of policy question that, you know, we will sort of give advice on kind of in the course of business. It's probably worth saying, and I know this is going to start sounding really annoying, but it's just partly a reflection of where we are in the government's kind of life and kind of the sort of time that ministers have had in post to work these things through. But we have committed to a long-term housing strategy, specifically in the new year, and I think that is the place in which all of this will come together to explain how all of the different changes that the government's made are going to be focused on driving growth in housing supply. That's not to say we haven't taken action already. We absolutely have. The government has taken action on housing supply already, both with the consultation on the new National Planning Policy Framework, which we consulted on. We announced that consultation at the end of July, so only sort of weeks post the general election, and the consultation that we put out recently on social housing and on changes, for instance, to right to buy. So I'd sort of point to those as areas where policy has already been announced. Everything else we'll be working through in the course of preparing that strategy. Do you want to say something else about public works, or is that it? Yeah.
I mean, I should acknowledge that the announcements on right to buy is really welcome, particularly from local authorities that are losing their housing stock. Being able to retain 100% of right to buy will make a difference. But I return to the point about viability, because I do think it is fundamental to supply. You know, the housing crisis will be solved through a multitude of different avenues, but it is a balance between long-term investment and short-term, and homelessness, which is what the committee is focusing on today, is causing that pressure at the moment in terms of public finances, and I think you've acknowledged that. So, you know, I think the point around longer-term investment to help save money in the long term is a point I'd emphasise.
And the only thing I would say, you know, with all my experience as a chartered surveyor, you can do all these things: planning, viability, right to buy. But as the previous government found out, if you haven't got the skills to actually do the building, the bricklayers and the carpenters and so on, you're not going to produce the numbers. So I think that is something critical that your department needs to address if we want to get the housing numbers up.
Yes, I agree.
That's the answers we like. Yes, nice short answers. Thank you very much. Right, Nestle, have you?
Well, I just wanted to. I mean, I think you've probably answered this, if I'm honest. But you know, the question was realistically, what needs to change for housing targets to be met?
I mean, I'll point to the fact we're getting a comprehensive housing strategy that will focus on both supply and quality next year. But if you look at the evidence that the Housing Minister gave to the Housing Communities and Local Government Select Committee, I think last week or the week before, it goes through the fact that, you know, it's very, very challenging to do this, but it is a whole range of action across both the supply chain, as Sir Geoffrey's pointed out, on kind of like skills, on planning, on working with developers, on breaking down barriers to development, on building up the role of kind of SMEs in developing property so that we're not entirely dependent on a few kind of large developers, on our reforms to social housing, the New Towns Task Force, building up the capacity of local planning authorities to work through cases faster, the work that we've done to set up a new homes accelerator in order to break through some of the barriers that are holding back stalled sites. So, you know, it's across the full policy spectrum. Action on lifting housing supply.
Sorry, Nestle, have you finished?
I don't think I've got any further questions.
Thank you very much.
Just briefly, I'll just say, are you as bamboozled as I am that some local authorities spend millions on temporary accommodation, yet are really slow when it comes to determining planning applications for social housing? And how can you as a department get local authorities thinking in that joined up way?
Well, I mean, setting them compulsory planning targets as part of the new National Planning Policy Framework obviously places extra pressure on local authorities to be meeting housing supply.
Okay, thank you. Clive Betts.
Right, okay. You mentioned the housing strategy. Just ask about that. So you just mentioned the targets local authorities are going to have, they're going to have to deliver on in terms of housing supply. But in this strategy, will it also give clear targets for the number of social housing units that you have to be built during the period of the strategy?
So absolutely, kind of, we are looking at. I'm afraid I couldn't make a commitment about the content of a strategy that is ultimately for ministers to decide on. But you have heard our ministers before say how committed they are to social housing as part of this strategy. There is also kind of the commitments to increasing the amount of social housing that we will be building, the money that is being already committed to the Affordable Homes Programme.
Let's move on to the issue of the pressure on local authorities. Just one question, we've already dealt with it to some extent. Not asking you to name authorities, but just to give some idea of the scale, how many authorities are coming to you and saying that next year they're going to have real problems meeting their budgets for a temporary accommodation, either as the key problem they've got on their financial situation or one of the key problems?
I'm very sorry, I'm not going to go through the details of how many conversations we're having. Firstly, because actually we have said to councils, our doors are open, so they should talk to us. And historically, lots of people have talked to us about their finances, and we do that all the time with them. We encourage them to do that. But secondly, just for issues of confidentiality, actually, I do need to sort of protect that space for that conversation with individual councils, and for the very basic factual point that councils at this point of the year will have had the statement that we made last week about local government policy design and the structure, if you like, of the local government finance settlement, which described in words what we're going to do, and then they'll be waiting for their individual allocations on a provisional basis, which we'll do in the usual way in December, and then they will know where they are. So I'm really sorry, but I'm not going to give a detailed commentary as we go through that process with them. What we have said is that we are expecting that some authorities will want to come to us. Ministers have been very, very clear that if councils, sadly, in this context, why they are rebuilding the basis of lots of local government finance, if local authorities need to come to us for help, we have been very clear that our door is open.
Right. I think just trying to get some indication as to whether temporary accommodation spend is now one of the key issues that are driving.
We've already said that. As I said earlier, over the last few years, I think if you'd asked a few years ago in general about the sector, their level of pressure, you would have seen children's services and possibly special educational need very high on their list, which I know this committee has already thought about so far this term. More recently, exactly following all of the data about the increases in the number of people who are homeless, temporary accommodation is a more prominent part of the data sets we publish and the conversations we have.
Right, it's probably more a question for DWP, but in terms of the pressures local authorities have got on temporary accommodation, it's one of the problems that they're actually are funded for their costs on grant which is related to the value of the local housing rate in 2011. It does seem really not a real calculation to do, isn't it?
So I think we covered this earlier, and specifically just referenced the fact that kind of, you know, there's these two different things. There's obviously the sort of housing benefit that is available, but then there is also the funding for local government, and that the sort of pressures from that is what's reflected in the local government finance settlement.
Right.
I want to just comment on that, Mr. Wolfe. So my understanding is that it's just been uprated to the 2024 values for the 30% quartile.
Confusing,
yeah. I think
we're confusing two things as a committee. Just on the one hand, the LHA rate, which is the one that you alluded to around the 30% reference point in a previous autumn statement, and then the temporary accommodation subsidy, which I think was the one that Mr. Betts was alluding to.
It's my fault. Yeah. Okay.
So, right. The temporary accommodation subsidy, then, you're saying that's been absorbed into the...
Well, no, I mean, I'm happy for colleagues to comment on why that rate is as it is, but I think what we were discussing earlier is the fact that that is a pressure on local government, and therefore is one that we have to take into account.
Right, okay. But surely DWP pay it. Why is it paid at that rate? What is the technical reason why it's paid at that rate?
Well, the Secretary of State at the Work and Pension Select Committee on the 13th of November talked about the LHA rate, the temporary accommodation rates, and said that there had been difficult choices as part of the budget. So the decisions had been to continue with Extend the Household Support Fund discretionary housing payments, to change the deduction amounts in UC, and the LHA rates were left as they were maintained this year.
To get confused again, those are issues that benefit individuals. Local authorities are not getting the full cost of their temporary accommodation covered by DWP, are they? They've got some artificial rate related to 13 years ago. That's the reality, isn't it? As temporary accommodation requirements go up, every person put in there costs the authorities money because DWP don't pay the full rate. That's the case, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, in 2011, so it always has been a subsidy, so temporary accommodation rate has never covered the full cost. So there was always a subsidy to incentivise local authorities.
The subsidies the local authorities are putting in is getting bigger all the time.
That's correct, and it's set out in the NAO report.
Yeah.
Coming on to the issue of general funding for homelessness, there are so many funding streams, aren't there? I mean, we've mentioned some of them there. There's what DWP provides, and then there's obviously the money in the local government finance settlement, there's homelessness prevention grant. How many different funding streams are there that relate to homelessness?
I mean, happily, we're able to point to the fact that in the local government finance policy statement we've set out that we're actually going to be rolling together 3 of those streams to run alongside the homelessness prevention grant, which is the main source of homelessness-specific funding from MHCLG to local government. So I think it's the... I learned these earlier, but now I can't remember what they are. The Rough Sleeping Initiative, the Ex-Offenders Grant, and Housing First, that we are rolling together as a recognition of the fact that there are multiple funding streams coming from our department that we want to try and consolidate.
How many different funding streams will be left then that local authorities?
So fundamentally, at the start of next year, 25-26, we will have one big grant that covers the sort of the main rough sleeping services and the services for single homeless people, and then we will have the homelessness and prevention grant. We do additionally have some small pots of money where we're contractually still obliged to continue, or just a couple of other pots like that. But we have both committed in the statement that we published last week to change the structure of the funding like that, but we've also committed just more generally to move in local government funding into the following year into synthesising more grants and pulling them together, because as we have discussed with you before, there are certainly many too many funding streams going into local government, and you would not find any disagreement in MHCLG on the need to synthesise wherever humanly possible.
These are all allocated grants rather than grants to be bid for, are they?
Penny might want to come in on this.
Yes, so homelessness prevention grant is an allocated grant. The rough sleeping grants that we've just talked about have been previously done on the basis of co-produced bids, but one of the changes going forward will be to simplify and do that on the basis of allocations to reduce that burden on local authorities.
And what is left for local authorities to bid for them?
In terms of the...
in terms of any grants related to homelessness?
In terms of the MHCLG grants, there won't be any bid for grants next year.
Right, and anything else in any other department with regard to homelessness that has to be bid for?
I'm not sure we have a full list like that. They don't leap to mind, but we can...
We can't think of any that would be... We can't think of any that would be under those. So if we...
The move towards not having competitive grants but having allocations and synthesising where possible is absolutely locked into all our departments.
It's a cross-government commitment to move in that direction. So we would expect other government departments to be doing the same.
Right.
Do you wish to come in, Liesl Canniscan? No, you're happy. Chris, please, Chris.
Yep, thank you. You've talked about the homelessness prevention grant there. When I look at paragraph 3.9 in the report and also paragraph 15, why are local authorities spending so much of this homelessness prevention grant on temporary accommodation? You've kind of touched on that quite a bit, but I just want to ask that question and then I've got a follow-up.
Because fundamentally they have a statutory duty to provide temporary accommodation if somebody is in need, and as more people have been identified in need and as homeless, they've had to spend more on temporary accommodation.
So thank you for clarifying that, but it also means that they're not getting to spend an awful lot on prevention activity.
That's right.
So what can you do to incentivise more prevention activity when they're currently dealing with such a big problem? It's a bit that's getting squeezed.
No, absolutely. And in fact, I think I answered this question earlier in talking about the fact that we obviously recognise it would be better to be spending a higher proportion on prevention and less on meeting the kind of costs of people becoming homeless. That is something that we are actively considering as we move into allocations of funding for next year.
Actively considering is one thing, but I would imagine this has been on your radar for a while, that the prevention side is getting squeezed. And certainly if you're going to incentivise local authorities to do this, the more you incentivise them, the more they're going to come up with interesting ideas. There's enough of them there that somebody will come up with something if they're existing in that space and exploring it. It's sort of incumbent on you to help them make that time, make that space available to do it. So I wonder if you could talk about what you could do. What's the thinking in the department to get them to spend some time in that space or more time in that space?
I think there's possibly a limit to what we can say at this point, because actually we will be working through, and as Sarah has said, are thinking actively about how to promote prevention activity, actually for all of the reasons you talk about, because of its importance and because we have been aware of this change of behaviour over the last few years, and also very sympathetic and understanding of local authorities why that is happening. But I don't think we can get further into that at this point, because actually the ministers will have to make decisions and it's not for us to sort of preempt those. What I would say is I completely agree with you about the point, both about the importance of prevention and, as Penny was talking about earlier, around the best practice sharing that we think we can do, looking between different authorities and different strategies. It's certainly the case that different places have slightly different strategies, slightly different combinations of how they intervene in the housing market, how they work across different agencies, and that brings different strategies forward.
I mean, there's basically a number of different things that you can do here to try and create space for local government to spend more money on prevention. One is to reduce the numbers coming through as presenting as homeless, which, it depends on a whole kind of systemic set of changes that we've discussed in this committee, including kind of addressing scarcity. You can also reduce the cost of the temporary accommodation that they're procuring, or look to do that. We've talked about that as well in this committee. We've talked about the work that Penny's team do to try and spread best practice in procurement of temporary accommodation. But we've also talked about the significance of local government having multi-year settlements, which enable them to plan better and therefore to potentially provide that temporary accommodation more cheaply, and that will create extra space for some of the homelessness prevention grant to be spent on prevention instead. And then there's also kind of how we allocate the funding, and all of those are under consideration, or I think, as we've sort of shown, sort of things we're taking active action on at the moment.
And one last question: how squeezed is this? This is more an opinion I'm asking you. How much, how squeezed is the ability to look at prevention being, given how big the scale of the homelessness problem is?
I think for local authorities, financially, they will have the increased homelessness allocations from the budget, and that will be built on top of their wider local government finance settlement, which we've said goes up at 3.2% real in the core spending power. So they will combine those income sources and work out how to look at them together, in addition with some other income sources that are going up. So I think it will vary authority to authority financially, and some of what we set out last week was around the government's decisions to start taking some decisions around moving additional funding to different authorities than previously have been prioritised. So, for example, there's a new £600 million recovery grant going into the local government finance system, which is focused particularly on looking at need and then considers also a local area's ability to raise income through its tax base. Now, the proxy that we use for need there is deprivation. So you can see that may help an authority that has a high deprivation rate and a low tax base, and that may affect their ability to deal with homelessness pressures, amongst other things. But I think you'll see it in the round. I also think their housing market's going to differ enormously place to place, which makes it yet more complex.
Yeah, I think last comment, I think it's just important to protect the space to fix the dam as opposed to plugging the dam, which seems to be what's happening an awful lot. So I'm getting an assurance that at least you're protecting that space for these conversations.
We're highly aware of the fact, as we answered earlier, with regard to value for money as well, kind of the significance of making sure that we're preventing rather than dealing with the consequences of homelessness.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, with your permission, Chair, I just wanted to make this point, because the point around value for money is obviously it's a huge amount of taxpayers' money that is used to cover the cost of homelessness. But one of the reasons the public find it so difficult to accept that such amount of money is spent is because the quality of housing that it's spent on is just so poor. We're not spending taxpayers' money and funding landlords providing good accommodation. It's like the worst accommodation. So I wanted to make that point, which I think officials would recognise. And then I was going to ask a question around the quality, but I don't know if we're coming on to that, Chair, or if we've covered it.
We're very happy to raise that.
Well, I would be interested in what officials would think about that point, and how we can use taxpayers' money to help drive up standards through either procurement or through other legislative powers as well.
I mean, I'm afraid I don't have anything to add to the answer I gave earlier on this, which is about both the kind of current responsibilities of local government when it kind of comes to the procurement of temporary accommodation and the suitability of it that is set out through the Homelessness Code of Guidance, but the fact that we are actively we're taking through the Renters' Rights Bill at the moment. The Renters' Rights Bill has a relationship to issues to do with homelessness in a number of ways, both the abolition of Section 21 no-fault evictions, but also, crucially, the application of the decent home standard to the private rented sector, and the power that is being taken in that bill to apply the decent home standard to temporary accommodation, something we'll need to consult on because of the wide range of accommodation that makes part of temporary accommodation, but but ministers have been absolutely clear their intention is for the decent home standard to apply to temporary accommodation. It's also worth saying there's a whole range of, while there are gaps in the regulation of the private rented sector at the moment, which forms part of what is provided in temporary accommodation, which the Renters' Rights Bill is addressing. When temporary accommodation is provided in social housing, obviously there's a new regime for the regulation of social housing to look at the quality of it, and that would apply in those instances.
And the truth is, isn't it, I'm just going to focus on procurement, because whilst local authorities are encouraged to procure better to get more value for money for the taxpayer, what that really means, particularly for London authorities, is that they're being forced to look way outside London to procure, if they're lucky, in units of hundreds sometimes, because that's where they can get the value for money. And so really it's the case that going forward, local authorities are going to be en masse relocating their residents who are finding themselves homeless way outside of the area that they are from.
We talked earlier, didn't we, about sort of out-of-area placements and the kind of challenges that they face, and obviously they are not kind of what we would want to see in future being as much of the norm as they are at present.
I think one of the things that's picked up in the end...
That's what is happening, isn't it?
As we acknowledged earlier, there's been an increasing use of out-of-area placements, which is obviously really problematic for people's outcomes.
In order to achieve better value for money for local authorities, we would also be encouraging local authorities to do just that, which is to procure outside of very expensive areas.
Well, actually, what we are really focused on in policy terms is improving the supply of social and affordable housing in areas of need.
That takes a number of years,
Absolutely takes time, unfortunately. It's very, very difficult to do it in the short term. We've had some success with the Local Authority Housing Fund in local government, local authorities being able to use that in order to sort of bring sort of former private rented sector properties into ownership for kind of use for these purposes, but obviously there's more to do.
I think the only thing I would add to this is that one of the things the NAO report picks up is that some authorities are procuring more temporary accommodation on a sort of nightly basis or a high-cost basis, which we understand. So actually, we're doing two things about this. Firstly, just very practically, Penny's team do work with authorities sometimes on best practice, and some of our test and learn works at what what really works practically locally. But also, as Sarah Healey was saying earlier, when we move to a multi-year settlement, which the government has been very clear will happen, it can't happen in the first year of the Parliament, but beyond that, that long-term planning horizon for local authorities financially will actually give them the tools that they have certainly been asking us for some time to plan and procure as best as is possible.
And presumably and hopefully to borrow too, because whilst it takes a number of years to be able to add to the overall supply of housing, there are also good examples of where local authorities have procured buying property, essentially, whether it's in their own area or outside. They've borrowed to do that. Local authority finance legislation, my understanding is, doesn't allow that, but there have been creative ways of being able to achieve that.
So the many different regulations that govern local authority finance, I probably shouldn't go into too much detail here. Local authorities can borrow for certain purposes, not others. Lots of them are set out, and we're happy to clarify on that, anything that's helpful.
Okay. Anna Dixon.
Yes, if I may just follow up. I mean, I was very shocked to recently learn of a local hotel in the Shipley constituency that's being used for temporary accommodation. So whilst I welcome the sort of idea that, one, we're going to have better standards, the decent home standards for the social rent, that there's also, under the Renters Reform Bill, the government will be bringing forward that to be extended to private rented. I think from the NAO report, about 10% of that private rented is B&B and hotel. And I just want to come back to this point that, the example that was given to me was that basically a room only had a kettle, so tea and coffee making facilities. And so our local food bank is actually having to put together specifically designed food parcels for residents there that doesn't actually require anything more than just adding boiling water. So, these people are living with very restricted diets. So the idea that we're going to be able to up that to anything like any decent standard, I mean, it's just isn't the truth that we just have to focus on putting an end to it. And I suppose that's where I would be wanting to sort of say how much, you talked about sort of this team that goes in if you've got a few families. But actually, even if you're not a family, even if you're an adult with no children in that circumstance, that is not a circumstance that we should be housing people in. So I just want reassurance, really, that rather than looking for some fix that might find a way to apply decent standards, that basically B&B and hotel accommodation is never going to be fit for purpose, never mind for families, but just for anybody.
I think we said earlier, kind of like the legislation is clear on kind of the point on B&B accommodation, and that is the position. It should be absolutely minimal use, like for emergency only.
Yeah. So what more progress and support is needed for local authorities to shift that? Because
I'm really sorry to repeat myself, but it's basically all of the range of policies that we've set out during the course of this hearing. I don't think there's a kind of really quick fix here. I don't think local government would be using these B&Bs and hotel accommodation if they had alternative options. Obviously, we would like, as much as possible, like authorities to be able to learn from each other where people have found solutions. But fundamentally, when you've got scarcity of supply, sometimes that, local authorities are not doing this by choice because they think that it creates good outcomes, because we know that it does not.
I suppose it just feels, knowing so many people are in those circumstances right now, that whilst I totally appreciate that, we've got ministerial task force coming, we've got a long-term housing strategy, this is, not only money wasted, but terrible, terrible outcomes for people, that, there isn't a sense of sort of more to be done. I realise that to solve the problem, we've got to do these bigger things.
Well, of course, the funding that we're putting in is also kind of designed in order to both prevent but also enable local government to be able, where possible, to identify housing that is not this kind of housing. So, the extra funding is there for that purpose. And you're absolutely not going to find us disagreeing with the kind of point that this is a really core outcome.
No, hang on. We must have a bit of order in this committee.
But fundamentally, and if the deputy, if our ministers were here, they would, which they obviously aren't because they don't come in front of this committee, but they would be like here absolutely emphasising that kind of we are doing everything that we can in the short term, but also wanting to fix this problem in the longer term.
I think the Permanent Secretary's been quite fair in her answers. We will look at her answers very carefully and we will reflect on your answers. I understand members' absolute frustration. I share the same frustrations, and we will reflect on that. Sarah Hall, hopefully this time not interrupted by the bell.
Thank you. I would like to go back to the Homelessness Advice and Support Team and look at the kind of role that they have. Given the rising trends in B&B use, how effectively is this team supporting local authorities to move away from B&Bs? How effective are they in doing that? What kind of support? So if a local authority comes to you and says this is a situation, what happens next? Are there any kind of weaknesses in that system? And also in terms of the frequency as well, is there any kind of measuring in terms of how many, if this is a repeat issue in a particular area, mapping those frequent people that are using, needing to use the B&Bs, for instance, to map those issues?
So on the first part of the question about what support does the Homelessness Advice and Support Team provide, so as I said earlier, we have advisors who are recruited with deep experience of working in local authorities, sometimes in the voluntary sector, with experience of the legislation and experience of operating these kinds of services. They work individually with local authorities. They also have thematic expertise that might be on ex-offending or TA procurement, for example, and they keep a regular dialogue with the local authorities for which they're responsible.
Whereabouts are they based? Are they national? Are they based centrally and then they're sent out to various areas when they're needed, or are they embedded in regions? Or
so each of the advisors will have a range of, they're divided geographically, north and south.
They understand their areas.
Yeah, and in terms of where they're based, they're based out of MHCLG offices all around the country, but they generally spend their time out and about with local authorities, working with them. And so they'll keep a regular contact with those local authorities. There might be then, as I said, we review regularly the local authorities on a quarterly basis, which local authorities have more than 5 families in B&B over 6 weeks, and that's what triggers the B&B elimination plan. And that will be a more detailed process to work with that local authority to develop and agree the B&B elimination plan. Outside of that, we do particular in-depth visits or deep dives with local authorities if there are particular issues that we're concerned about or that they've brought to us, and that will involve us maybe putting together a sort of a cross-disciplinary team to go and spend some time with them, and that's been successful in helping some local authorities deal with particular issues. That might be procurement, that might be sometimes we'll help them to sort of raise things up the agenda with their senior management and so on. And I wouldn't want to name specific local authorities, but we know that for example B&B elimination plans are successful and have helped local authorities to reduce their usage of B&B over particular periods. Sorry, you asked a question about repeat homelessness as well.
Yeah, in terms of, so you've got the team goes in when this is triggered, but if this keeps happening, if the frequency
of the local authority.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so that would be one of the things that would be something that we would monitor within the team, whether there's recurring issues with a local authority. But I mean, as we've discussed at this committee today, a lot of this is driven by particular housing market dynamics. So what we would be seeking to do is see what are the things that are within the scope of the local authority to improve in terms of performance management of TA procurement. Obviously, there'll be things that are wider economic drivers which would not be within their specific.
Yeah, I know that local authorities, there might be extra roles or additional roles that they think the team could offer. So, for instance, kind of support with funding applications. Is there a dialogue going on between the team itself and local authorities to see what the right level of support is?
Yeah, I think the point that the NAO report mentions about funding applications, I think, was specific to the single homelessness accommodation programme, which was a capital and revenue grant scheme that we have run over the last couple of financial years. but we've come to the end of that co-production process. But in general, we would always be looking at what local authorities need. It's a mixture of support and challenge, but what the team is not there to do is to, I suppose, to replicate or to
case manage.
Case manage. It's a sort of external support and challenge function.
What about best practice examples? So in terms of sharing best practice between local authorities, does that happen quite a lot?
Yeah, and we do. So for example, we ran a series of roadshows earlier this year, which brings local authorities together to do the sharing of the best practice. We have a regular quarterly meeting with the core cities, which brings them together to facilitate them to share information. We do thematic, as I said, so we've done a series of roadshows and events with the Ministry of Justice and the Prison and Probation Service to bring local authorities together to look at the kind of end-to-end pathway through out of prison and the support that both MOJ and my team provide through CAS 3 and the Accommodation for Ex-Offenders programme. So we do a whole range of things that we think can help and support them.
And that's being fed back by the team to you guys as well, so it's being factored into whatever you're doing.
And I think the benefit of this external facing team then is that they can feed back into the department's policy making what they are seeing on the ground as well. So it's a sort of a circular process.
Okay. If colleagues haven't got any more questions, I've got one sweeping up question, Ms. Healey, if I may. We've had evidence from a Mr. Nigel Cook, who says, in relation to veterans, the Prime Minister has stated we will repay those who served us and house all veterans in housing need. But the witness goes on to say, but there's a lack of housing for veterans, as homelessness amongst veterans rose by 14% from 1,850 households in 21-2 to 2,110 in 22-3. And he says there's a risk of not meeting the Prime Minister's aspirations in this. Do you have anything you could usefully tell us about this? If not, I'm very happy you should write to us.
I don't know whether Penny does.
Well, you'll know that the department laid, I think, some regulations just recently, which is to exempt veterans from the local connection test for social housing. So that's sort of a major new step forward. But there are also a range of other support that we provide and the Office for Veterans Affairs provides specifically for veterans. So some of those things come out of our department, but some of them come out of the Office for Veterans Affairs. So there's some specific housing, as well as the Operation Fortitude, which is a specific telephone helpline and resource for veterans, as well as the additional funding that the Office for Veterans Affairs provides as well, which is sort of veteran-specific help and housing.
Yeah, and of course, like, as Catherine mentioned sort of earlier, kind of precisely one of the MOD and indeed the Office for Veterans Affairs are part of the cross-government working group, specifically because of the importance that the government attaches to veterans and preventing veteran homelessness.
We look forward to what you have to say on that in the future.
I should say that you so bamboozled me by asking for the data at the beginning that I failed to say congratulations on becoming chair of the committee and congratulations to Mr. Betts on becoming deputy chair. So I'll say that now.
He's about... No, he may. He may in due course.
If you're nominating me, then I'll say...
Will I have that power?
The chair has the power. I gather that Luke Charteris would like to chip in on question 21,
sorry,
please.
I know we've skipped on. I was just going to ask on the use of B&Bs. It's effectively a classic economics problem. It's not clearing properly. On the supply side, you'd rather build a house or you'd rather purchase a house, but a B&B's plugging an immediate supply side deficit there. Do you go into local authorities as a department and help them do that kind of forward demand side forecasting? So you could almost look back over 3 or 4 years and say, had you have actually procured your own reserve property in the private rented sector and kept that almost on the balance sheet as a reserve, that would have been better value for money. Do you have you got like a financial...
We do not go into local authorities and tell them how to do their own financial planning, which they do themselves. obviously, I don't think you'll find a local authority that wouldn't prefer to be spending the money on a kind of longer-term investment than a sort of shorter-term B&B funding. There's just a fundamental challenge about the length. I mean, I think we've talked already in this committee about the length of time that they are funded for, and the fact that we've been doing single-year settlements and they haven't been able to plan ahead. And that's the kind of thing that we're trying to address through the multi-year settlements that we're talking about.
It wasn't so much about the financial planning side of me, it was about the forecasting of demand for temporary accommodation.
Right.
And then to forecast that future demand. And you could have looked back over 3 years and you could have said, well, had you have anticipated that level of demand and actually bought a property or two, it would
if you'd had the funding to so do, yes.
Well, again, I suppose all roads lead back to that. But there's an element of kind of resource forecasting here of demand, and I just think some local authorities that I've kind of worked with don't always have the level of skill.
Nothing more to add? Right, if colleagues have got no further questions, may I thank our witnesses very much. We've given you a fairly comprehensive grilling this afternoon, I feel. You've been very good at answering those questions. We kept within the 2-hour time window. I'm threatening you with 3 hours next time.
Clearly, we don't.
2-hour time window, and may I thank my colleagues also for cooperating with that. So, order. Thank you very much indeed.